Hi, I'm Tina Ayers. I'm a member of the Nephrology Transplant Clinical Research Unit. Today, I want to focus on creating budgets, the basics. The agenda for this presentation is to review how to look at your study protocol and its design, how to review the study schema, development of a study budget. We'll touch on budget negotiation and management, and also discuss briefly reimbursement. When you start out with your protocol, you should try to have a number of processes running at the same time. This will ensure that you have a very timely startup of your protocol. You want to be developing and negotiating your budget, while any department reviews that are necessary can be performed so that you can get the study submitted to the IRB. At the same time, you're going to be submitting your contractual materials for review and negotiation by the parties that are responsible for that, all with a goal of finalizing everything, hopefully close proximity in time, so that your budget, your contract, and your IRB approval will become available about the same time. So when we start talking about a budget and a protocol, first off, I was going to introduce the cake. So what in the world am I doing with a cake? And I'm talking about budgets. Well, like anything else, when you bake, what is important? The ingredients. The same is true when you're working on your budget. You've got to ensure that you look at all the required elements of the protocol in order to be able to secure everything that you need in the budget. You want to look at what's required in terms of laboratory tests, the study procedures. Is there a study drug or a device perhaps, so that you'll need to involve research pharmacy? What study-specific elements are going to affect your manpower effort? Where will the research occur? And then review the protocol for items that are not in the schema, because there's always going to be some items that seem to find their way into the text but never make it to the schema. So now we're going to touch on development and negotiation of that budget. So we all know what a budget is. We live day to day with budgets. The same is true for when you're conducting a clinical trial. You want to make sure that you have an adequate budget to be able to cover your expenses that you'll incur, as well as to cover your manpower needs. So you want to analyze the protocol. Again, think of them as the pieces of the puzzle. You want to look at laboratory tests, procedures, the study drug, or perhaps a device, and that will lead into whether or not you have pharmacy needs. Look at research nursing, data management, administrative effort. What is going to be required of your principal investigator? What supplies are going to be available, and what are you going to do with data at the end of the study? As you're analyzing the protocol, these become your building blocks for your budget. You're going to look at key personnel. You're going to look individually at lab costs and procedure costs. You're going to look at what pharmacy needs are going to be in terms of cost. Are there indirect costs for your institution, and what are they? And what miscellaneous costs do you need to make sure you don't forget? So first off, you're going to look at your key personnel costs. You want to make sure you're thinking about what's required of your principal investigator, the study coordinator. If you have a second person involved, that will be a data manager, your pharmacist, administrative effort. Is there clerical and financial personnel involved? Is there a nurse manager overseeing the overall process? And what's required from a regulatory standpoint? For your principal investigator, you want to think about, are you going to do a fee for service? In this case, it would be per patient, it might be per visit, or it might be as it relates to a treatment cycle. You want to consider the extended time that may be involved in performing the research. Will there be teleconferences he'll need to attend? There's going to be a review of CRFs periodically during the study and at the end. There'll be monitor visits that the principal investigator will need to be involved in. You may want to look at all of this in terms of the effort for your principal investigator. For your study coordinator, you want to look at your study initiation processes. Will there be an on-site visit? Will there be in-service of staff and the areas involved in the conduct of the study? What will be involved in terms of screening and recruitment? What will be the involvement of your coordinator in patient care? Will they perform the enrollment, patient education, direct treatment for the study, follow-up? They'll be responsible possibly for toxicity reporting, any quality of life questionnaires, and things like diaries if it's a pill study. From an administrative standpoint, they may also be responsible for handling IRB submissions, interacting with FDA from a standpoint of submissions of, in particular, safety reporting. There may be special areas that you need to involve, in which case there might be an in-service needed for those areas. And they'll be interacting with monitors. They'll be scheduling monitor visits, working with the monitor as they review the data. There'll be telephone, fax, computer time required. There may be hospital rounds and certainly some study visits. They'll be involved in CRF completion and query resolutions, and they are responsible for maintaining billing compliance. If you have a separate person for data management, their responsibilities kind of fall right behind what the study coordinator will be performing. Many of these elements are essentially the same. If it's the same person, then they kind of will rotate their nursing and data management responsibilities one behind the other. But you need to ensure when you're building your budget that you have allocated enough time for the nursing criteria as well as the data management. So I usually recommend that you separate these out as two line items, even if it's the same person performing both functions. You're going to want, you will need to work with your research pharmacist in terms of your pharmacy costs, involve them in discussions of the protocol. They're a valuable resource when it comes to knowing about the drug, if it's a drug study, what kind of side effects you can expect. That will facilitate your ability to estimate your nursing time when you're building your budget. They'll need to give you information in terms of what it's going to cost to dispense the drug, mixing it, labeling it, storing the drug. Ordering and tracking will be maintained by your research pharmacist if you have one. They will be responsible for drug returns and or destruction at the end of the study. They will also interact with possibly IRB queries, FDA queries, monitors, and the staff performing the study. You'll need to look at laboratory and procedure costs. You need to identify what your local policies are and any guidelines that are available. You need to review them and be aware of what they tell you need to be doing. There may be a local review required. Your labs and procedures will probably be billed by providers, and you need to make sure there's a mechanism that if something is dedicated to be paid for by the study, that there is a mechanism in place to ensure that that bill will make it to you to be paid. Remember that your costs are time sensitive. You should always budget for increases. You need to look at the length of time the study will be performed and estimate what you think increases in your costs will be each year, and somehow include those increases in your budget. Ancillary areas may need to be contacted for their own costs to build into the budget. It may mean that if it's an infusion study, for example, that you need to contact the infusion area and get specific costing for that area. Various areas may have their own fees associated with being involved with a clinical trial, and you just need to make yourself aware of what these are for your area. Don't forget, you may need to include patient stipends in your budget. These may be driven by what's in the protocol. Maybe you're asking the patient to have an extra biopsy or other invasive procedure. And these can be time-consuming. They may require extra office visits, in which case you may also need to be thinking about the travel time, parking expenses you're asking the patient to incur. Sometimes the pharmaceutical company, if it's industry-sponsored, will give you some guidance on this. And many times when you submit to the IRB, they may also provide you some input on patient stipends. In terms of miscellaneous costs, don't forget that your institution or your location may have indirect costs that you need to include. There may be local IRB or central IRB or special research area costs. Screening and recruitment costs. Are you planning to advertise for screening and recruitment? What will that cost you? What is storage going to cost you? You may have storage for the drug with the pharmacy. You may be collecting samples for the study. Are they going to want you to store those samples until the end of the study and then ship them out? Then at the end of the study, you're going to need to think about where will you store the study data, because there are multiple requirements for how long you must maintain that data. If you have to get medical records from another location besides your own, they may have a fee for making those copies for you. What are your costs in machine use, your copiers, your fax, your computers, your freezers? Is there something there that you need to cover? Will social services be involved? What supplies need to be included? This may be office or it may be medical, and I'll follow up with some questions to provide to the sponsor to help you with this. Will the study involve electronic data capture? I know it is touted many times that this really resolves a lot of the issues with data management, but from a historical perspective and the experience and others that I interact with, electronic data capture can really affect your manpower effort. So you need to be aware of what the systems are, and as you gain experience with the systems, you'll be able to better judge on future studies what the impact of the electronic data capture will be for you. Are there going to be overnight shipments required for various documents or study samples, or will they be batch shipped and sent at one time? Will have to go by overnight courier? Is the sponsor going to provide that, or is that something you need to include in your budget? Some reminders I have thought about. When you start working with a protocol, try to make sure that it's final. Many times you'll get a sponsor's protocol, and it is the version that they're sending to the FDA because they're wanting to get the ball rolling. Time is critical to everybody. But what will happen is the FDA may make changes. They may be insignificant, not affect your budget, but then I have encountered times when they were significant. Basically, I needed to start over from day one working on that budget. So it's important to try to find out if that budget is final so that you know you're not spinning your wheels. You should always date the budget you're working on and link it to the protocol version you used to evaluate the budget and the date of that protocol version. I always mark my budgets with versions. I start out with version 1, and then as I make changes, it will become version 2. As I negotiate with the sponsor, it may become version 2, 3, 4, etc. But that way I keep track of the changes I'm making along the process. Again, don't forget to allow for annual incremental increases in your costing. Make sure that screen failures are addressed. Various sponsors will have different ways to handle this. Some may give you X number of dollars per screen failure, blanket coverage. Others will give you X number of dollars for a screen failure, and they'll allow one screen failure for 2 or 3 patients enrolled. You just need to know what your criteria are. Excuse me. Are there any cancellation fees? Should you do all this work and the sponsor withdraw the protocol, Will they be willing to pay you for the time and effort you've spent up to that point in time? My experience has been most of the time sponsors are very willing to do this, but you have to ask. What are your study monitor visits going to include? How long will they be? How frequent will they be? And they will be taking up your manpower time, so it's important that you know how much time you're going to need to dedicate for the nurse and or data manager for the monitoring visits. Is there a need for on-call pay for certain particular situations? Will you have internal startup meetings? Will you also have an internal meeting for ancillary areas that will be conducting part of the study on your behalf? When protocol amendments come in, it's critical that you always look at them in light of your current existing budget to see if they're going to increase your costs. If they increase your costs, it's important that you go back to the sponsor and notify them of this and ask to renegotiate the budget. Post-study, there'll be queries. There may be requests to notify study subjects. There may be some FDA interactions, etc. So try to keep that in mind when you're working with your sponsor. Here's some kind of generic questions that you can start off with the sponsor, and you can always start with a list and then add to it as your experience with building a budget proceeds. Will there be a central lab? What samples will be sent to the central lab? How often? Where's the central lab? Will all of the safety labs being conducted for the study be performed on site, or will they also go to a central lab in addition to potentially biologic research samples? Will the sponsor be providing collection materials, shipping materials, an air bill with costing being covered for the overnight courier? Will there be other central reviews required? Perhaps a central cardiology review, might be a centralized radiologic review. Sometimes there are centralized pathology reviews as well. Make sure you have requested any study manuals that will be applied to the study. You need to acquire that information and review it because it, again, will affect your manpower. How will study payments be generated? Will they be automatic after a monitor visit, or is the sponsor going to put the responsibility on you as the site to generate an invoice to receive your funds? Many times, if they want you to do the invoicing, I would suggest at least starting off asking for an invoice fee because your staff is going to be covering, using their time to generate the invoice, track it with the sponsor, ensure payment is received, go back and reconcile it with the cost that it covers. And that's not a small, 5 or 10 minutes. Many times it can take quite an amount of time, so you need to keep that in mind. And I always try to encourage sponsors to make their payments to the IRB directly, rather than they want the WERB or other central IRB to generate their invoices to the site, and the site turn around and have to spend their manpower to then pay the WERB invoice and then submit an invoice to the sponsor for reimbursement. So again, I try to encourage you to ask for either an invoice fee or an administrative fee of some sort to cover the expenses should you have to do your invoicing in this manner. Budget preparation can take on many forms. In the good old days, it was simple enough that you could do pen and paper or maybe a word processor. I highly encourage you to never try to use this method going forward. Our budgets are much more complex these days. More is required from a billing compliance standpoint. So I encourage you at a minimum to use an Excel spreadsheet. Many sites now are using electronic systems that are a clinical trial management system that helps them maintain information in this manner. So I would encourage you to use the first two methods. The last two really have become pretty antiquated. There are different types of budgets. There's a summarized budget, a detailed budget, and I'm providing an example as part of this presentation of a detailed budget. Here's an example of a detailed budget that is what I call a beginning budget. Across the top will be the time periods, the visits, if you would, of your clinical trial. Down the left will be the activities, procedures, and as well as your manpower, you'll see down at the bottom that I list as your patient care activities. Everywhere that the protocol requires a procedure to be performed, I have placed an X on this Excel spreadsheet. Then I take this spreadsheet and the protocol and I review it with the principal investigator and the coordinator to discuss what of these items would be standard care. The standard care would be those items that you would perform for this patient population, whether or not they were on a clinical trial. So now this next budget is one where I have negotiated. On the budget, you'll see items that have been changed from an X to a 0. Those actually would denote those items that were identified as standard care when I reviewed with the principal investigator and coordinator. The other items that have an X are the items that I will expect the sponsor to include in the study budget. And then down at the bottom, I would come up with a total per visit, because in many cases, sponsors may want to pay you per visit, or at a minimum, you'll be able to add things together and see what your cost would be for a cycle, if they're wanting to pay you for a cycle. So this becomes a very basic template to start off in building your budget. As I said, always review your budget with your PI and your key personnel. In this case, it's your clinical staff, your coordinator, and you also need to involve, if somebody different is going to be handling the financial component of the study, it's important to keep them involved, or it's important for them to have you involved if they're the ones actually doing the budget for your study. The PI and coordinator should designate items that are standard care, as I mentioned. That would be the items that are appropriate to be billed to and reimbursed by third-party payers, your insurance carriers. If there is ever any doubt about whether something should be standard care, always feel comfortable in contacting your third-party billing group. You may check with local areas in terms of a compliance office or your patient billing offices. Any one of those would be a great resource for you to ensure that you're making the right decision on your standard care. Once all this work has been completed, you're ready to finalize the budget. Any changes that have been made with any one particular person or group should be reviewed overall with your staff, especially your PI and your coordinator. Always remember to build a non-refundable administrative startup fee. That work is typically separate from the budget you're developing for the per patient budget. Your administrative startup fee, I've got several items for you to remember in a following slide set. Whatever's required at your site location, make sure you get the appropriate internal approvals to move forward, and then submit your budget to the sponsor for approval. I typically use a summary budget with the sponsor. Many times they don't want to see all the details, but at a minimum I will provide them an Excel spreadsheet with the X's so that they can see what is being included in that per visit cost. And my next item is negotiate, negotiate, negotiate. This is a process that you will go through with your industry sponsors. They may come back and say, we just can't do that. You say, all right, so where do we go to from here? You'll have some sponsors that will come back and be, very forthright with you and say, this is the best we can do. And regardless of the process, you work your best to get your costs covered because that's what you're expected to do. Once you do finally get a finalized budget that's been negotiated with the sponsor, always remember to date that budget and mark it as final. For that non-refundable, and it's important that it be titled a non-refundable administrative startup fee, this is the cost that will be incurred to get the study up and running and ready for enrollment. It should be non-refundable because no matter what happens during the course of the study, these activities were completed and you need to cover the expenses related to them. Remember that when you're starting a study, here are some of the items that will be included in that process. The sponsor may send you a feasibility questionnaire. You may have to participate in a site qualification visit or at a minimum a telephone conference. There may be attendance at investigator meetings, and yes, the industry sponsors will typically cover the cost of the travel and the expenses of meals and a place to stay going to the investigator meeting. But the staff going to the investigator meeting are now away from site, and you need to compensate for the loss of their being able to work on another study and generate revenue for your unit. There may be internal review processes that the cost of which need to be covered. You've got your initial IRB submission activities, regulatory document management up front before the study ever starts. You're compiling documents, you're submitting them to the sponsor, you're making revisions based on sponsor requests, you're setting up binders for your regulatory work, and then don't forget you're doing the budget development and negotiation, and that is time from your unit that needs to be covered. Then there'll be an initiation visit that is typically conducted at your site. It may be by teleconference, but still there is time needs to be allocated for that. And then are you going to have startup meetings before you can even open the study for enrollment? All that time needs to be covered. Remember to also look at payment schedules that are being proposed in the sponsor's contract that they send. It'll be in a draft form. I usually try to look at how they're providing the budget information and develop my budget spreadsheet to kind of flow in the same manner as their budget does so that we're able to compare apples to apples. And they may be doing their budget on a percent per enrolled patient. They may be giving you a percentage payment based on a completed treatment cycle, or they may give you a percentage payment for a completed patient, and you always need to make sure you look at your contract to know what the definition of a completed patient is for that study. They do vary. Are they going to pay you so much per CRF or per visit? And will those payments be on a monthly basis, a quarterly basis? Will they be based on having to have a monitor visit in place? All of this is important in trying to structure what your payment schedule will look like. You want to make sure that you are ensuring actually that money is coming in at the same time that you're incurring expenses. In terms of budget management, typically you want to set up a study account for your study. If you have a study that has more than one source of funding, it's probably a good idea that you establish two separate accounts for each source of funding. And then you need to up front allocate what will be paid for out of each study account. You may want to pay for manpower out of one, you may want to pay your tests, your labs, procedures out of the other, but you need to know which study you should be using to pay for what assays, tests, labs, procedures, as well as your manpower expenses. And your study expenses that are incurred when you pay for a lab test, when you pay for a procedure, they should all be charged to that account. Then at the end of the day, you'll be able to go back and see how you did with your budget. So as I said, you want to look at what those reimbursement issues are. Know what the contract specifies. Then you're going to need to develop a methodology for tracking and documenting your patient screening, the visits, any monitoring that occurs, CRF collection per patient, so that you know at any given time where your enrolled study participants are, so you know what you are owed. If you are lucky enough to move forward and have an electronic clinical trial management system, many of these systems have a mechanism whereby they will facilitate this for you. There'll be a good bit of entry to be done, but the output at the end of the day will be more than worth its wealth in what you've done to set it up. If you're not getting your payments from your sponsor, be proactive and invoice them. I have done this many times, and some sponsors may come back and say, we will pay you, after such and such time. And, you can agree with them on that time point. And what I have seen is that once they realize you really are tracking this information, they've been usually pretty good at staying on top of it themselves. You need to always make sure that if you have unusual expenses crop up, one time, unexpected, that you get sponsor approval in advance for them to receive an invoice from you to cover those expenses that are related to that. And then invoice them as they occur so they don't fall off your plate. Then at the end of the study, when you've done your reconciliation and you have a final invoice that you're sending to the sponsor, it is good to always mark that as a final invoice so everybody knows we're done with the finances for the study. At the end of the study, there's some evaluation that you can perform. Did you end up with a balance in the labor versus reimbursement, or was there a deficit? Were there hidden costs that were uncovered during the course of the study that were covered, or maybe they weren't covered? Were the monitoring visits with this potential sponsor, or if they're using a CRO with this particular CRO, labor intensive, much more so than you had anticipated when you developed your budget? And then, was the payment schedule equitable? As you incurred your expenses, were you able to generate revenue to cover those expenses as they were incurred, or at least as much as possible? Many times sponsors will offer up that they'll pay 75% and hold 25% till all queries are generated and resolved. We try to always negotiate that as well, to a minimum, maybe a 90% payment with 10% withheld until queries are resolved, for the reason that we're having to cover your manpower expenses, we're having to cover expenses for labs that are being paid for, procedures, and other items. Is there room for improvement regarding the cost of doing the trial and the bottom line for this trial? And bottom line is, if you had to do it again, could you do it for the same amount that you developed in your budget? And that would be without having to have developed a method to get supplemental resources to cover those costs. From a billing compliance standpoint, if you have something in your budget, a lab, a procedure, that you have identified as needing to be paid for by the study, and the sponsor, when you have negotiated that budget, has agreed to that service being covered, don't ever bill third-party payers. Remember, you need to have a mechanism in place whereby any bills that need to come to the study will do so. And at this point, I have finished this presentation. I hope you will find it of benefit, and it will be helpful as you move forward working on your own budget. Thank you.